Welcome to Wilmic's Risk Management Information Podcasts. I'm Tom Watson. In this podcast, we will talk with Marie Stanton. She is managing partner of Hurley, Burrish & Stanton in Madison. We're going to talk about client selection. Marie, you have been in a small firm, a big firm. Tell me about how you go about selecting clients. I guess particularly in this day and age when the economy is difficult, lawyers, maybe particularly the small firm or solos, need business. They're afraid to turn business away. So how does that factor into, making sure you're not taking cases you shouldn't take?
Well, there's several factors I consider, Tom, when someone comes to our firm. You've already touched on the first one because that's been a hallmark of my practice. I want to take a client and offer my services if the client's problem is something that I can address. In other words, do I know what I'm doing? And if I'm overreaching, that client's problem is going to be on the corner of my desk or moved around the office, which is what I want to avoid. And frankly, in terms of the client being happy and me being happy, I need to know what I'm doing. So that's the first of several things.
Have you ever over the years taken clients you wished you hadn't?
Well, in terms of the practice area, a few times, and I had a good talk with myself and I wouldn't repeat it for a couple of years because it's just not fun not knowing what you're doing.
You mentioned, picking and choosing. How hard is it for lawyers, do you think, to say no when they need to?
I think it's pretty easy if you've been burned. And by that I mean either you've done a poor job or the client fired you, or in the middle, and good for you, you had the sense to recognize the problem and refer the client. So I think it's pretty easy if you acknowledge that there's been some form of failure in the representation. If you plow through and you're content to do a mediocre job, that's a poor situation, and that's really a poor practice method.
Do you think with experience you get better at determining which clients you should take and which ones you shouldn't?
I think you do. You learn to adhere to one tenet that I have, which is, for example, I'm always willing to be someone's second lawyer, but I won't be their third lawyer. The number of lawyers a client has had in the past on the same matter is obviously a red flag for whether or not you even want to talk to the person or take the case. So I think, yes, experience can tell you when you're beyond your practice skills, and experience can tell you when this client has had one lawyer too many.
You mentioned the red flag of being the third lawyer or even beyond that. What about other red flags? Are there some that you kind of use as barometers?
Sure. A large one is people come to us midway through a case in which they are appearing for themselves. Somebody who's filed their own medical malpractice case or personal injury case. Those kinds of situations are large red flags. Or somebody who's not hired a lawyer at all and hasn't done anything, and tomorrow they have the scheduling conference. Those are usually loser situations from the start, and you're just not going to be able to please your client or, in fact, get the result they probably would have received had they started earlier with counsel.
You mentioned what we call dabblers, lawyers who take a case maybe beyond their area of expertise. I think that's an important point. I know we see some lawyers who, in our claims experience, who probably have gotten involved in an area that they didn't know enough about, but they didn't want to say no, and they took the case, and of course they came to regret that. How does a lawyer make sure they're staying away from areas that they probably should stay away from?
Well, some years ago I was at a Wilmic board meeting, and it was noted that of all the cases that are submitted for defense to Wilmic for malpractice, most of them result in a lawyer who has practiced in an area which encompasses less than 10% of his practice. So in other words, if 80% of the time you're doing real estate, but 4% you're doing divorce, and there's a malpractice case, that's where it's going to be. So I lost track of your question. Were you asking me to identify when you know you're getting out of your league?
That's a good place to go, yeah. I sort of was getting to that area. As really the whole issue of getting it. I think there are different reasons lawyers get involved in areas of practice that they shouldn't, but I think you're on to probably the big one.
The thing to do is ask yourself, when is the last time I did this kind of case? Or how many times this year have I represented somebody in an employment discrimination case? If you don't answer that with a pretty good-sized number, you really ought to move them to somebody else who does it more regularly.
On the other hand, a lawyer might say, well, if I shouldn't take a case that's not in an area that I've done much practice in? How do I expand my practice? How do I become a better lawyer in areas that I'd like to be involved in, but I haven't? I mean, taking cases that not in your area of expertise isn't always a bad thing, is it? I guess you have to make sure if you do it, you're doing it the right way.
Well, there's three ways to address that. One is you can get some training, take some seminars, and do some reading. Another is you might mention your interest in your firm, or if you're in a small firm, to colleagues. Shadow somebody or pair up with them. And then the third way is to go ahead and take the case. But take a modest case. If you want to break into, let's say, personal injury work, don't take the faulty hip replacement. Take something a little more simple, maybe a mid-fracture shaft in the arm. So maybe bite a little bit, not the whole thing.
We talked about the economic times. You think lawyers are, in fact, taking cases that they might have 10 years ago passed up because other areas have dried up? But, for example, I guess I'm hearing about some family law attorneys who are getting into bankruptcy because the family law practice sort of has slowed or even dried up.
Well, there's no shortage of writers right now, Tom, who are printing articles in every conceivable law publication to tell you how to make money in tough economic times. And one statement I'm seeing repeatedly is that the two areas of law that seem to be flourishing are bankruptcies or foreclosures, and the other area is actually personal injury cases, or those which take a contingent fee, because it seems unaffected, of course, by the practice of law. So, there are some real economic struggles, and they're taken note of.
Finally, give me your general advice to younger lawyers in particular about client selection generally. Maybe a list of 3 or 4 things, many of which you've probably mentioned already, but kind of the general blueprint that they should follow when it comes to somebody walking in the door and they have to decide, is this a client that I want?
Well, first of all, you may want to look at the client and make sure it's the kind of case you can handle. Is it in your area of expertise? Secondly, look at the individual themselves. Who's going to be the lawyer? Is it me or is it them? You want to make sure that you're the lawyer. Thirdly, you have to work out a good fee arrangement. And I think it's Jay Foonberg, has said there's only 3 words, which comprise a good fee agreement, which is cash up front. And work out something realistic so that as a young lawyer, in your enthusiasm to take a case in, you don't get somebody who's got a couple $1,000 for a $20,000 case and you'll never see any more. And then I think the last thing is you have to commit yourself to do the case. And if you're not really interested, if you're interested in only opening the file, which is always easiest to get started, and there's a lot of pleasant handshakes and well-wishing, but you want to stay the course. Make sure you're good today, that you're good 8 months from now, because often things just don't wrap up very quickly.
Thank you, Marie.
You're welcome, Tom.
You've been listening to a Risk Management Information Podcast, a service of Wisconsin Lawyers Mutual Insurance Company. For more information about our company, visit www.wilmick.com or call 1-800-373-3839.